A good murder mystery has a corpse, a sleuth, and clues that lead to a more satisfying conclusion than the butler did it. Much like we know stories about secure code can rarely end with the compiler did it. Which means this week we talk with Cynthia Burke about data privacy and why data security is just the starting point for piecing together the complex puzzle needed to make privacy effective. In the news segment, the mystery of the security engineer, the case of the Evil Go package, the deserialized body, the exchange murders, and more. Check your alibis and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Application security is hard when security is separated from your DevOps workflow. Security has traditionally been the final hurdle in the development lifecycle. Iterative development workflows can make security a release bottleneck. With GitLab, security is built into the CI/CD process. Every code commit is automatically scanned for security vulnerabilities in your code and its dependencies. Results are delivered to the developer in their native workflow for rapid remediation. Learn how GitLab enables DevSecOps. Visit securityweekly.com/GitLab for a 30-day free trial. Cloud-native development presents new challenges for security teams. Ephemeral workloads are scattered across services, and it's hard to identify resources, monitor configurations, and ensure compliance. Prisma Cloud by Palo Alto Networks is a comprehensive cloud-native security platform, delivering full-stack protection for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. It provides deep visibility, threat detection, and data security, as well as protection for hosts, containers, and serverless while enforcing policy guardrails. Visit securityweekly.com/Prisma Cloud to gain control over your cloud security.
This is episode 142, recorded March 8th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Good morning. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing quite well, and hopefully you are as well.
I'm peachy.
Peachy. Excellent. I bet I know why you're peachy, because you've been staying in the loop on all things Security Weekly by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe. To subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, and to join our Discord server. And you could be chatting with us right now. If you missed Security Weekly Unlocked, you can now access all of the content on demand by visiting securityweekly.com/unlocked. You'll find plenty of informative discussions among the offensive, defensive, and strategy and culture tracks. Cynthia Burke brings more than 15 years of IT and compliance experience to Capsulate. Prior to joining Capsulate as compliance manager, Cynthia was an assistant director and program manager with KPMG's International Audit Division, leading projects to develop KPMG's audit collaboration tools. Hello, Cynthia. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, we have you here to talk about data protection and data privacy and all things protecting data. But all things protecting data are more than just encryption, data security. So maybe we should start there. You know, why are we talking about, or give us a teaser about why we'll be talking about privacy on the technical and compliance side of things. And that's much more important, or that's much more than just talking about the security side of things.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much going on right now, right? Any compliance professional, privacy professional will tell you that 2020 and 2021, they were game changers in terms of new legislation, new privacy laws in multiple states across the US, the invalidation of the EU-US Privacy Shield. It's more than it's ever been for a privacy professional, security professional, to kind of take in and understand how to implement in a reasonable way without disrupting production, quite frankly.
Yeah, and I think, just starting with talking about the U.S., there's a lot of laws that have come through, but we have 50 states, so I'm going to guess we have 50, maybe even 51 different things you have to keep in mind. Just how complex does that look right now?
It's kind of mind-boggling, to be honest. Both from a compliance professional's perspective as also a security provider perspective. just to give it, I mean, honestly, we'll talk about maybe there's about 15 states, I'll say today, that have privacy legislation up for consideration this calendar year. But that information that I said will be out of date in probably less than 2 days. It is happening so fast in real time. And, like you said, 50 different states defining privacy in 50 different ways. So it's really, what is privacy? Privacy is now a homonym. I've just started to say to my colleagues, it depends on which lens you're looking through from which state, of what that means. And so, yeah, for a security engineer, chief privacy officer, compliance manager, it's a lot to manage right now.
And it's got to be a lot to. Go ahead, John.
Up until a few years ago, the way a lot of folks thought about privacy was like, okay, figure out which state or country has the most, I'll say, aggressive terms, and we're just going to do what they do. So, like either GDPR or California, New York.
Right.
Is the juggle for you more of keeping track of all the different states, or keeping track of who is the most has most stringent regulations that you guys have to keep track of? Which is sort of the most? Which way do you go on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it kind of gets to the heart of the challenge, actually. If you want to use like the principle of least privilege, but apply it to maybe compliance in terms of data privacy, GDPR is certainly, the parent of a lot of these schools of thought. But there's privacy rights activists who should rightfully be enthused about the fact that we're talking about this, the fact that we're digging into this subject overall. But from, an implementation standpoint, it starts to get super complicated super fast. There are not common understandings of even what personally identifiable information is. So I cannot use like this principle of least privilege or most restrictive. Like, what is the most restrictive? Honestly, if I were to look at the legislation and kind of just summarize from what I understand in my reading of what's up for votes this year or up as legislation, honestly, I'd say Washington State, which has not passed, but it probably is the most aggressive in terms of the controls and the rights that it's attempting to give to consumers. But when we're looking at 50 different states and we're not even agreeing on what constitutes personally identifiable information or private information, how there is no common denominator. I mean, we're even having disagreements in states on what constitutes the word sale of personal information. So our lack of definitions is really, I think, goes to the heart of not being able to discuss this in a uniform way. There's not uniform terminology.
And that kind of ambiguity has to make it really tough too on the on the app side of things, the technical side, to figure out, well, what should we be doing? Because I think some of the states are also, you pointed out the ambiguity in just what is personal information, but a lot of the laws have gone beyond breach notification, right? And they're starting to look at other things, like what other are these requirements coming out that possibly are still ill-defined?
Okay, so it's a great question again. Almost, I think this is a true statement. Every state has some form of breach notification. So let's just take the California Consumer Privacy Act, which was a ballot measure. And in 2020, actually, the California Privacy Rights Act was on the ballot and was passed, which gives a governing body in California the right to oversee like a data protection authority. So that's really focused on consumers and the rights that a consumer, me, would have to be able to call up a firm in California and say, hey, what do you have in terms of personal information on me? And may I see it? And may I edit it or delete certain portions of it? So this gets to, data access and data, integrity monitoring, file integrity monitoring, data access monitoring, identity access. Where if you go to like New York, we look in New York State, and it's really focused on, at least the New York Shield Act, is really focused on breach notification and, the types of timelines that a firm would have to notify New York State about a breach and consumers about the fact that their personal information. And again, New York defines personal information differently than California. Personal information, personally identifiable information, is a subset of a larger umbrella called private information. So, yeah, it's just a perfect example of how every state is kind of coming at it through a different lens. I mean, again, Washington State, which hasn't passed yet, they've been really aggressively, working on a very broad bill, but it has a section in there about there can be no surreptitious surveillance. Well, I'm going to think for a long time about exactly what that means. And where Oklahoma, one of the reddest of states, has some of the most stringent kind of restrictions about personal information and data privacy up again for as legislation this year. It's just a kaleidoscope, when you look across the 50 different states of how we're all approaching this, and it's creating next to a near impossible job, for a security professional.
No, totally. And I have to say, as an aside, I'm going to steal surreptitious surveillance as like some smooth jazz band name or something like that.
Great.
But
great.
So you've pointed out, the difficulties already of dealing with different states, different regulations, different requirements that are possibly not even well defined in terms. Now I want to throw in there the technical side of things too, in the sense, we have the Apple Store, and they've started pushing for like disclosure requirements, right? Or sort of like privacy labels for their apps. How does this start to impact the ecosystem? Is it making it just, what does this mean in terms of complexity? And does this have any bearing on, everything you were just talking about with states as well?
Yes, it does. And, this morning, thinking about coming on here and talking to you folks about data privacy for a bit, I couldn't get that 80s commercial. We were talking a bit about, there was a guy who played a doctor on like a soap opera, and he was hawking cough syrup, and he said, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV, and then recommends this cough syrup. I really feel like we're asking our security engineers to be security engineers, but play lawyer and, understanding what I need to do to meet compliance measures on production systems. And I think that's where it really starts to get into, okay, so what does this mean from a practical standpoint? For me, who's trying to keep a production infrastructure secure and compliant, what does it mean to me? How am I going to translate all of these different state laws into an application to make sure that I'm secure and that I'm compliant, regardless of what state law I might be held liable to? And there aren't great answers right now, unfortunately. But I really think I want to bring home two things. And first of all, it's that, don't make your security engineers play lawyers on production systems. This is really a separate job within an organization. If you're a medium to large size business, this is enough movement and enough serious teeth in the legislation in terms of litigation possibilities for consumers that organizations need to start thinking about privacy officers or broadening the compliance departments to include legal counsel, or at least reference legal counsel on these issues. And then translate that into business requirements for your security teams and how operations may have to adjust to meet those standards. As an example, California's law, the laws in California have a lot of access, rights for consumers. And it, starts to bring up questions in terms of how you've kind of categorized and classified and organized your data within your organization. Are you prepared to give an end user access rights to corporate data? It's a real requirement now for some organizations. But again, I think, creating requirements from a body within your organization that is not necessarily on your security team, because they have to be focused on what they're meant to do, which is keeping data secure. You can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. So translates privacy requirements trickling down from different states into business requirements or security requirements, and then give them to your teams to implement. I think that's kind of like the primary recommendation I would make right now to most organizations.
No, that makes sense. And so I have to ask too, looking at this from the naive perspective, I'm going to have to guess that I can't just say as the security team, we encrypt at transit, we encrypt at rest, and that takes care of confidentiality and therefore privacy is resolved. Because you were just explaining very succinctly right there about access rights. So what does this mean then? We have, as you're describing, a privacy officer or a data officer pushing requirements to a security team. Would this also lead to even possibly like a privacy engineering team? In other words, engineers working and developing, implementing these types of requirements. And if so, where can they start to look for? Are there frameworks that can help them out of this cloud of ambiguity?
Yeah, no, that's a great place to start. So I do think if those organizations start to grow, and they will become necessary, it will happen, and it's happening fast. Again, 15 states right now in 2021, but it'll be 17 next week, So once that kind of division is established and we can push requirements of compliance requirements down to security teams to implement, like what do security teams do in the interim? And just to start to understand what a best practice might be. And I would recommend, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST. A lot of folks who've gone through any kind of FedRAMP accreditation are deep into some NIST, 853, 837. But they did publish just last year version 1.0 of a privacy framework that's really enterprise, like leaning through the lens of enterprise risk management, which they tend to do. But it's definitely a good place to take a look and maybe start a gap analysis. In addition, I think a lot of people focus on ISO 27001, but there are additional provisions 277001 and 2 are around a privacy framework, privacy for information systems management. And also NIST has got some projects going on right now that are just in the infancy in terms of really taking from the community. And I can't stress this, how important this is for the community to get involved, security, engineering, and operations, to talk about, I'm cloud first, I'm fully cloud native. A lot of the challenges organizations have right now are these compliance controls as they stand. Like we talk about FedRAMP, we talk about SOC 2. If I'm cloud first, if I'm cloud native, let alone forget Linux, none of these controls necessarily even map to what I'm doing today. I'm already challenged. Now throw data privacy, like access rights into there, and it's going to be, my head's going to explode. So again, I think get involved in the conversation with NIST around best practices, so those can be hopefully reflected in the controls moving forward, and start to look seriously at either NIST or the ISO 27701 privacy frameworks, to just have kind of a groundwork.
Yeah, I think John and I like to joke quite often about we come across long articles or long PDF documents and joke about, that's some reading homework for us. And I tried to prep for this and was reading through, for example, the NIST privacy framework you pointing out. It's just barely a year old now. And, one of their points is conduct a privacy risk assessment by using your data map. And I had to pause right there and think, right, we need a data map. So suddenly it sounds like there's just tons of foundational work to do, right?
Absolutely. It's like dun, 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 data map. Yeah, exactly. Yes. There is. And have you segregated your, customer data, or in New York, it's even more complicated in terms of what private information means. into a repository that is more accessible to consumers than maybe, say, my corporate data. Do I have a data map? Do I have a data strategy for that? Identity. Again, I think 2021, we're going to start talking a lot more about identity and access management, not only, internally, but how are we going to, from an organizational standpoint, that identity now being the perimeter, now that we're all working from home. But also too, that we're going to have to start to have user-friendly tools that allow consumers to access their information on the systems that we manage. That's real. These are hard requirements in these new privacy legislations.
So I want to roll back for a second too, because you're bringing up the cloud, and I'm kind of curious. I want to ask, does the cloud make this harder or easier? That's rather than just sort of a binary question. Like, what about the cloud makes this different, or does it really matter that I'm in the cloud or that I have a mobile app, or what are the aspects perhaps maybe to consider when trying to look at these requirements that may make your life easier? I guess I'm just trying to grab for something to be helpful to say, oh, I need to make some technical decisions or some design decisions. Mm-hmm. What might be a great way to help that mind along?
Well, I guess really two things about the cloud. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of efficiencies, and you can start to bake in compliance with like a cloud first approach in terms of, hardening images or having prepared images dependent on kind of the compliance needs. So I have, say, a PCI workload that I need to spin up that's subject to PCI requirements. That can be pre-baked in terms of all of the patching and controls that I might need. So if you are sophisticated enough of a shop that you can start to think about this and bring it from kind of like the CI/CD pipeline into production, sure, it can be easier. But I also think there's like a false sense of security that if I move this to the cloud, I'm suddenly going to be compliant in many areas because if I leverage cloud infrastructure, sure, my cloud service provider can give me a lot of these accreditations just downloadable off the shelf. But there's still shared responsibility, especially when it comes to data. That's not the cloud service provider's, kind of ball of wax in terms of something that they're going to help you with in terms of compliance. And so for privacy, I'm not sure that it really, in what we're talking about in terms of organizing a data map, moving to the cloud is not necessarily going to accelerate that. It's still an exercise the organization will have to undergo regardless of where you are on that cloud native journey. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yeah, it totally does. And I'm sitting back here, my list of things to do on the technical side is getting longer and longer. And right. It's mostly like, what is going on the legal side? How do I become, it's a little bit more dangerous to say, I play a lawyer on TV. And now, like you were saying, now I have to play one in my code. That's right. Just kind of a scary prospect because, and I think too, looping back to the beginning, you were also pointing out a lot of the things in the news of what the consequences can be of yes. messing up privacy from breaches or other things like that. I don't know if there's something more that you maybe want to emphasize there about why this is so important to have a discussion about.
So in 2020, the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act existed. It became enforceable in Jan 2020. The New York Shield Act became enforceable in March, I want to say, of 2020. So, we were all a little preoccupied, understandably, but both of these have teeth in terms of the consumers can litigate. And I think we are and have seen at least in GDPR, if we use that as any kind of baseline, massive fines. I mean, we really are setting up privacy to have the legislation that exists and is up for consideration in different states has the same kind of teeth that we've seen in some of the kind of catastrophic GDPR fines, in the EU. We're setting that up in the US right now. And right now, California, with the CPRA, has, again, a data protection authority, which is kind of a governing body, which can actually implement fines and fine companies for compliance violations of the CCPA. Right now, they're kind of our de facto US data protection, data protection authority, because no other state really has one yet, but I'm sure they're coming. And yeah, there's real teeth to this.
That's sort of interesting for our listeners to think about, because we've had these things now for a while, right? And it sounds a little bit, I think, like I'm going to screw up my analogies, but crying wolf, from the point of view of we've been hearing about, oh my God, GDPR is coming, and then California, New York, and blah, 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 Washington. And my understanding about Washington, part of the reason this has been held up here is they've been fighting to try and put teeth into that law. And I think that's what you're just saying is actually a really interesting point for our listeners to sort of focus on. This stuff has been around. Yeah, we've been talking about it for years, but it's about to get sort of nasty if you don't, or excuse me, painful if you're not actually working towards compliance on this or are actually in compliance.
Correct. I think that is a fair statement to kind of really drive home. GDPR, we just have a couple years of data really now in terms of really what fines look like. And even if we use that as an example of what potentially could happen in the US, there are plenty of organizations out there who have analyzed GDPR fines and how the unevenness, even in the EU, of the application of fines. Italy is an example. I'm just kind of making this up, but Italy might fine an organization, several 100,000 euros, where the UK could move it to the millions. So there's a lot of subjectivity. It really reflects the values of the nation, the state in the EU, the member state in the EU, and it's going to be the same in the US. I don't think it's crying wolf if in terms of, if we look at the fines that occurred in the EU just in 2020, we are, I think, in the billions at this point. So, and the truth of the matter is, people care about this now. We're starting to get that eerie feeling that our phones are listening to us. We are starting to, maybe shop for something, and now I have tons of targeted ads at me. Not to mention, there's people who have, certain organizations that have real concerns about tracking. There's a lot of, biometric concerns. Illinois kind of is leading the way on that. But I do think there's an increasing awareness about the implications to my day-to-day life, me as a consumer. And it's people are you are going to start to see impact in terms of fines.
This is where we're just going to be quiet and consult our lawyers so we don't get some fines of our own. So one of the things maybe to sort of, as we get to the end here, what would be some ways, you mentioned, getting in with NIST, getting in with some of those frameworks, some of the working groups that are in fact working on this. What would be some of the problem statements, or what would be some of the areas where you would love to see improvements, whether it's better documentation, better requirements, better something else?
Yeah, no. If I had a magic wand, I would say that we need to decide on terminology. Uniformly across the United States. It's going to become next to impossible if private information means one thing in this state and another thing in that state. So I think clear problem statements. What are we trying to solve? Like, what are the challenges? What are consumers concerned about? Making that problem statement, and then making sure we all agree on basic terminology, like publicly identified personal information. What constitutes that? What does the term sale mean? Should consumers be able to opt in or opt out? Right now, we have a patchwork of, in Oklahoma, it's opt in. I think that's true. Yeah. And every other state right now, it's opt out. So that's going to be hard to manage in terms of my privacy notices on my website. Defining terms, having, recognizing that California right now being the only one with a data protection authority they could be de facto start to implement fines, that maybe that needs to move up to a higher level in government, maybe across the US. But before there's federal legislation, I'd prefer to see a standard definition of terms and a standard definition of care. The security engineer and security professionals are having to react to all this in real time. And the truth of the matter is, none of this is possible if I can't keep my production systems secure. So, asking them to jump into this project or that project isn't really fair if we can't even tell them what words mean.
What do words mean? I'm coming off, speaking of 80s, I'm trying to think of the songs that come to mind.
I know.
But in that case, I do want to just say, this has been quite an illuminating discussion. Thank you very much, Cynthia. And if we haven't made listeners' lives hard already on the security side of things, throwing in another 50 or so different, possibly competing requirements around privacy, I guess is going to keep them busy on a Monday.
Guess so. It's case the Mondays, I guess.
Case the Mondays. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Cynthia. It was great having you.
Thanks for having me.
I also want to thank John and thank all of our listeners. If you'd like to learn more about Capsulate, visit securityweekly.com/capsulate. Also, one of Cynthia's colleagues, Brandon, has an upcoming webcast on targeting, exploiting, and defending Linux, so make sure to catch that one too. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.
In a fast-paced tech environment, the potential attack surface increases with each release and new app created. Detectify automates cutting-edge knowledge from trusted ethical hackers into the development pipeline for reliable application security. Go beyond the OWASP Top 10. Check your web apps for over 2,000 known vulnerabilities actively exploited in the wild, monitor subdomains for potential takeovers, and remediate security issues in staging and production. Learn more with a free trial at securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself. Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/Capsulate today to request a demo.
And that was What Are Words For When No One Listens Anymore, and from our last segment by Missing Persons, as well as Cynthia Burke. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by completing the form at securityweekly.com/guests. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. Our next live webcast will be March 18th at 11 a.m. Eastern, where you will learn how to prepare Linux hosts for unexpected threats. Check out our chat with Brandon in episode 140 to get a sneak peek at the topic. Also visit securityweekly.com/webcasts to register. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they're available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And that brings us into the news, John, and I did not want to forget how to continue a new wave post-punk from last episode. And I also thought that shifting security right was a great way to have a callback to that episode, because this was an article that I think hit everybody's radar, and I was going to throw it onto the list, but you beat me to it. So let me throw it over to you to introduce this article.
Well, thank you. Yeah, when I was thinking about this earlier, I'm trying to get some sort of a tie-in between you turn me right round and turning left, or shifting left. I'm not quite there yet, so we'll have to work on that a little more. This is an interesting one from the guys over at segment.com. It's sort of the idea is, okay, well, security, we talk here for literally years about shifting left, right? And I don't think they really have the title quite right when they talk about shifting right. But the idea what they're trying to get is you don't just want to shift your scripts and your DevOps tools and your scanners and all these Band-Aids, as I refer to them, even as a purveyor of fine Band-Aids, they're Band-Aids. We don't just want to shift those things to the left, right? The guy with the security knowledge, if he doesn't, you've heard us talk about communication, stuff like that, but if he hasn't spent time in the trenches, if he doesn't know how to code, if he doesn't know how to, what goes on the other side of the wall, the other side of the cube, if he doesn't have either doesn't have experience doing it or doesn't have, some sort of understanding, then you're going to have a pretty serious disconnect between those two halves. And that's sort of boiling this article down from my point of view into 30 seconds. But I think it's worth, probably honestly rereading every few months, just keep on our mind.
Yeah, I think so. And the way I also express it is that it resonates for me in the sense that we often hear about security champions, but we rarely hear the converse of that of developer champions, as in, why don't we go drop a security person into development so that they can learn, that security person can learn how development works, building products. And I think that's really what resonated and stood out to me from this article, saying it, very eloquently, very well. And, it talks about just becoming a better developer in general. And the other thing that really stood out to me too is, there was, to quote, building customer-facing security features in partnership with dev teams help you better serve your customers. And that's another sentence that really I was inexpertly trying to get out of the, I think the McKinsey article from last week, where I was trying to talk about where's your product management or where's your product research from your security team in terms of what are they providing to their customers? Are they just saying, here's a bunch of vulns, go fix them. Here's a bunch of requirements. Now here's a bunch of privacy requirements, go implement them. Or are you, as a security person, taking on the responsibility of doing some of that work? Because one of those themes of DevOps is, as we've talked about, I think quite a bit, is the sense of taking on the responsibility of security. So why don't we also just say, hey, security, you should also be taking on some responsibility for actually building things. And again,
I really like the idea they had in here of actually embedding, right? I mean, you have to have both the management structure and the maturity in your org, but pick up someone and have them go work over on that side of things for a week or a month, and just if they're fixing the low-hanging fruit, right? The really simple bugs or the typos or things like that, get them into the process and get them a sense of what's going on over there, and realize that like when you're on that side, you've got 10 million things going on, plus bugs, plus customers, plus everything else. Oh, and you want me to fix something you think is a vulnerability that none of our customers have ever touched. So I think that's really valuable if people can do that.
I think so. And it's a great, the article sneaks in just that threat modeling emerges from exactly what you were saying. Just go fix a couple bugs, because it's asking some questions. Okay, you found some bugs to fix. Now spend some time on them. Where is the component used? How well tested is it? Do you understand what this part of the app is doing and why? Those are essentially threat modeling questions. And they come from doing the work and understanding the code. So just can't extol the virtues of this enough, in the sense of, I agree, not necessarily calling the shifting right, perhaps, as much as just go write some code as a security person to understand what devs are doing, or just to build that partnership with developers. Mm-hmm. So I think there's another couple of articles here, shifting gears a bit now, on supply chain. This is it's going to be the theme of the year, possibly because of SolarWinds is on everybody's mind. That was pretty cool. Things like typo squatting have been around forever, but we have new languages. We have new package ecosystems. One of them, in fact, is in Go. And here's another article that was highlighted for you, John. What stood out to you on this one?
Yeah, sorry, I have to close all my NIST tabs after talking to Cynthia. I think it is funny, right? In transparency, I was sort of quiet and not really putting in articles for a few weeks here, maybe over a month, because stuff wasn't just catching my eye, and I don't know if that was beginning of the year or what, and things seem like they're sort of, becoming more interesting again. And maybe that's me, or maybe it's the industry. I'm not sure which, and everyone can go in armchair quarterback psychology, that one. But yeah, so article about Go. And the concept of finding evil packages. So this guy went and did something interesting, in that instead of just looking and thinking and having a thought piece, he tried to put together, he did put together sort of a fuzzer, I mean, to use that phrase, which would go through, he was looking for a list of top packages, didn't find that, but then just came up with a list himself and started put together, how do you actually, what would you look for? So the thing about Go, for folks who don't know, whereas in, say, Node world, where you specify, hey, I want this package name, in Go, when you include a package in your source, you include the domain in there as well. So github.com/stretcher/testify is on my screen right now, one of his examples. So he started with the idea of like, okay, what happens if we either, start making small changes in either the name, the package name, or the publisher of it. And he went through and he found one or two examples in here. One was pretty just a mistake. The other one looked like it had a little more interest in it. But still, it's harder. I think the takeaway is it's harder to do in Go, the typo squatting, than it is in some other languages, but still something we need to keep in mind. And as usual, sort of catches my interest. Just the thought of how would you look for this in your code? I'm not aware of any open source tools which would go through. And I mean, how do you actually specify that I want to use this one version of a package versus another? One of my thoughts, there's something else out there I've been looking at over the last week or so, or 3 or 4. There's a package that the original author hasn't, he won't archive it on GitHub. So while there's a newer package which someone else is maintaining that's more up to date and has stuff going on, there's still confusion between, okay, which one of these two should I use? So, but how do you do that in your application if you're a Go person like me or Node or any of these things? How do you make sure the list you're using is the list, so to speak?
The list, absolutely. And I think it's good that we're starting to find some things that stand out and meet the Kinsella criteria. The other aspect too is it's cool to see this is how is Go reasoning through this. And I think a lesson I take from here is not so much Go versus npm, but what is Go doing that makes it more resistant, perhaps, to the dependency confusion, but just equally vulnerable to typo squatting, just because people type things in and make mistakes? And are those properties desirable? And would we want to then apply those properties if we were to take them over to npm, or just name another package manager, PyPI, for example, and so on? So that's how I also try to look at this, is just what can we learn from what people are doing well, and let's imitate that and try to construct something more robust over time, rather than just repeating yet another vuln, which in the case of JSON, we talked last week about repeating yet another vuln in the sense of parsers having problems. This was a article from someone who had read about that original dependency confusion, about JSON interoperability. I'm getting myself article confusion going, and said, and basically a nice write-up that approach, I'm a developer with security in mind. How would I try and avoid this problem? So it's a little bit of what you were mentioning there, John, about how would I perhaps avoid this problem of packages in Go. In this case, they were looking through mitigating mitigating JSON parsing using a framework or a library called Marshmallow. And again, this was a bit JSON Python specific, but I think some of the thinking behind this that came out in the article was pretty interesting, in the sense of having schema validation, having a comprehensive test suite, and understanding what are the security properties of the tools you're using, and are they in a better default secure state, and they're going to stop mistakes or ambiguity of data types or character encodings trickle through, or are they just going to bail out early and complain about them? So that's my long-winded way of saying follow-up article, go check it out.
Yeah, there might be a little bit of a article squatting going on here, possibly. This was interesting. Back to sort of the conversation last week, I think a good portion of it, I remember saying, if you're working in a bunch of these different languages and you have to track all that type of stuff, that's God help you, man, and also that's a bit of a sign. As you're talking there, Mike, it reminds me sort of what a common, almost a code smell you'll get from a new young developer, where they're super interested, and they want to try all these cool different things. And the next thing you know, you've got 4 or 5 different languages in your project, and this is one of those examples of why you don't, you want that enthusiasm, but still you need to sort of shift it and focus it. But yeah, I like that they did the 1-2 punch of first sort of, these are all these problems, and this is how this is one way of thinking about them, with some decent code samples in there, which we always appreciate. So yeah, it's once last week scared you, this week will sort of give you a little bit of blue sky to think about and how you're going to handle this.
Exactly. Blue sky and Soylent Green for all of your code. There's the other, in the spirit also of, I was trying to look for articles that aren't just talking about here's yet another vuln, here's yet another vuln. I was also trying to gather some tools or some good defensive thinking. Another one I came across off of the Daily Swig from Portswigger, the creators of Burp proxy. They were talking about a .NET deserialization bugs. And again, this hopefully can still be relevant for those of you out there who aren't writing in .NET. One, just to read about what are what do deserialization attacks look like, because they exist quite a bit in Java, as well as they can crop up in JSON as well, JavaScript. And what was neat about this was there was a tool associated with it, and a paper by some researchers that was basically saying, here's how we essentially fuzzed or created a way to automatically look for this type of problem. And hopefully this is the type of thing that can then be generalized into other languages perhaps, or at least be something that's a part of your tool chest if you are on .NET, and at least have some idea or want to be able to think about, how do we find these types of deserialization problems? What are the patterns? And build from there.
So it was fun, and I'm still thinking about my comment on the previous article. There was a few things from Portswigger popped on my radar this week. There are a bunch of good stuff going on over there as usual. But now, after sort of thinking about this, I'm sort of wondering, was it my lack of interest in AppSec, InfoSec, or was it things not coming out, or maybe is it potentially my sources filtering out some of these articles? Not purposeful, but just I start my days with Google News, so I'm sort of wondering if maybe I wasn't seeing some of this stuff. Interesting to think about. Just leave that there by itself. But yeah, this. So I was going to make a .NET joke and tune out, but I think there's value about this. I'll sort of double down on what you were just saying, and it doesn't matter. I think pretty much any modern language right now has the ability to serialize, unserialize, marshal, unmarshal. And we were talking about this last week when we talked about the other article. As developers, it's very easy for us to say, oh, we've got this big JSON blob coming in, YAML, XML, pick your whatever. We're just going to run it through the built-in library and take the little few pieces out that we need and keep on going. And it's, at least in my neck of the woods, you don't see too many people creating API calls which return just the data you want, right? Usually you're getting a hell of a lot more, unless you're doing GraphQL or something like that. But usually you're getting a lot of junk and you only want like 2 or 3 fields. So the chances of having some sort of a marshalling issue going on in there, or memory leaks, or overflows, or all these different types of things, right? You might not have, talk again about Go, you might not have buffer overflows in Go, but there's still a lot of other sort of nasties in there which can grab you. So I think this general topic should probably be a lot more on people's minds. Probably it's not going to be, because we're all going to be thinking about SolarWinds for the next 6 months. But yeah, it's don't forget about this stuff either.
Yeah, we'll work on a good branding name so we can draw more attention to this topic. We'll get back to you in next episode. Yeah, there is also now, speaking of like vulnerability classes, in the news, Exchange was getting popped by the scary 0-day attacks. Cue the dun 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 that we used in the last segment. And in this case, I didn't want to focus so much on like Exchange, but to bring two aspects of a conversation here. One is, this is fundamentally the initial entry point is SSRF, which is a big deal, obviously in this case, and big deal for cloud-based apps, because SSRF is basically when localhost is no longer local anymore, and it becomes accessible from anywhere. And bad things happen in capital letters. What was really neat is that Microsoft released a Nmap scripting engine script, just a easy way to run Nmap to confirm if you're vulnerable or not to this. And you can see in that script, I should have linked to in the show notes, how trivial it is to exercise this SSRF, in this case in some cookie values. So SSRF, pretty easy to understand, pretty straightforward, and just as easy and elegant, I would say, to exploit. So I wanted to highlight the SSRF aspect of that, but then step back a second and say, let's say, imagine there's a big vuln for a mail server like this. There's, go out and patch. Microsoft also said, well, if you can't patch, here's some ways you might be able to mitigate But then the third unspoken aspect would be migrate. For example, why would you be running your own mail server at all? And one of those questions, isn't this a quote unquote solved problem that probably should just go to the cloud? And there I'm kind of, I think, trying to build a parallel to other thinking of what does it mean to have a move into cloud and run anything from, a managed provider. I'm trying to be vendor and language agnostic, so to speak, here for containers or, using Kubernetes, or even just saying serverless. The idea that I want to abstract as much of the problems of fundamental patching and quote unquote solved problems as I can and just worry about the code that I'm writing. So I don't know if any of that triggers some thoughts on you, John, or if you would just go in a different direction and say, let's move on.
This week on Application Security Weekly, I'd like to introduce everybody to our new drinking game for Application Security Weekly, where you take a chug every time John says, why is this company that has a $2 billion budget on security once again got basic, maybe not basic, but security issues. And I'll funny haha, but come on. And we've beaten that one to death, so I'll shut up. But several things here. I'll go in reverse order if I can keep track in my head. That means we're pulling off the top of this stack, right? They first, just around what you were saying. There's two things I never, ever, ever want to run again in my life, and I've run them both multiple times: mail servers, DNS servers. No, just no. I'm not going to do it better than a cloud provider. There is no reason to do it. If you're clutching your pearls and thinking about privacy and all that type of thing, dude, get over yourself. Worst case, go to one of the secure providers and hope that the feds don't get to them for another 6 or 10 months. It's just no, don't do it. No. So with that one out of the way, let's see who's next. Kubernetes, don't run that yourself unless you're developing for it. What I actually thought was interesting about this article came out before the article. I think it was a few days earlier last week, wasn't it, when Microsoft started pointing fingers at Hafnium in general. I think that was the first time they mentioned that particular actor. And I think their, I can't remember the name of the team, their threat team, threat response team, they seem like they're getting a little more vocal on I'll say attributing attacks to their originators. So that's sort of interesting to watch. They're opening their wings a little bit, and that's cool and interesting. We know these guys know a ton of stuff. So it's interesting to see them put a little more out there. The attack itself, or the vulns themselves, like you said, they're SSRF, deserialization. It's almost like we were just talking about that. Post-authentication, blah, blah, blah. By itself, it's a shrug. To me, there's a lot more interesting around the meta on this one.
Yeah, and I think we definitely won't spend too much time on this. I did link to Proxy Logon, which was the name given by one of the developer or the researchers who disclosed this to Microsoft. They haven't published technical details yet, but they promise that those details are forthcoming. The only other thing that kind of stood out to me is if you want to think about, what does a vulnerability from start to finish look like in a sense? The timeline that they posted was, October 1st. DevCore started reviewing the security on Microsoft Exchange server, and about 2 months later, on December 10th, 2020, they discovered this SSRF bug, disclosed it to Microsoft, and about 2 weeks after that, they were able to escalate that bug into basically admin privileges. So just kind of an informative anecdote data point of one. I will, make sure to caveat quite a bit, but just give a sense of what does it look like to be curious about an area of code, find an exploit, get a good working exploit of a bug. One of the things, perhaps, I'm trying to think of a good segue, but I'm failing at the moment, so that's why I'm just talking my way through it out loud, is observability. So this is one of the other articles that I pulled up, and I think it's in a way perhaps a good tie-in with the other one we were talking about, shifting security right, or in the sense of security working with developers. And this article it was a bit of a reminder about observability when we were talking with, speaking of Brandon, back on episode 140, I believe, and talking about targeting Linux, that maybe we shouldn't overspend our time and quote-unquote security budget on just hardening everything and shift to observability or just monitoring. And I will say, skip over the tired cliche of measuring and managing, quote. But I think there's some decent reminders in here, I'll say, about what does it mean to have metrics, and should they be, and how can they be informative for debugging your application, for being able to recreate an incident after the fact if you're working on that response side of things. So that's why I wanted to throw this out here as a developer practice that has some very, I think, direct security connotations to it.
Yeah, I'm going through some of my internal notes real quick for a name. We've been digging around on this stuff for weeks while we try to figure out what we're doing as part of sort of our architecture. How do we look at, metrics, visibility, all these type of things, and tracing, any type of modern microservices-based stack. I think you have to have some amount of this type of stuff, but there's so many things to choose from, right? So this is a CNCF post. They're looking at it from a CNCF point of view. I think most tools we're looking at I think they're sort of, there's probably some outside the space, but I think a lot of the more interesting ones are within the CNCF nowadays. But open tracing, and I just already lost a tab I was just talking about. There's another one out there as well, which was a merger of two, and that's what made it sort of interesting. They both sort of realized that things weren't going as well as they could. Man, I've got too many tabs. And they sort of brought it together. Here we go. Open telemetry. So there's a bunch in this space, and it's actually interesting to bring it back, as you were saying, to the shift left right right round blog post. Was I've seen internally as some of our guys brought Grafana up, they weren't really sure. This sort of just proof concept screwing around. What do we do with this thing? And they weren't sure themselves. But as they started getting data, you could see them start to, as you visualize some of these things for some of us, you start going, oh, what's that peak there? And they start digging in and going, okay, is that during a scan, or is that like, just like an hourly cron job? What's happening? You start, so it's, it can be a bit of a foxhole, but at the same time, it's, I think when you have that type of instant connection with any type of tool, but especially in this type of space, it shows that you're going in the right direction, and that your team's interested in it. There's a lot of value you can get out of this. So, as I say in there in the opening paragraph or two, 102 projects in this category. It's a lot to read through. There's a lot of videos on it. There's a lot of stuff out there. This is a nice taste. It's something, one of my favorite conferences, which I haven't gone to, which I really want to go to, is it Monitorama? I think it is, in Portland. I think they might have finally moved it, but like every year they have all these really great talks. Like this has been going on for a while. And with my operational background, this stuff is always sort of near and dear to my heart. But yeah, it's anything you can do in this area, you're going to help yourself. You're going to help your ops teams. You're going to get that observability. So if you do need to do some amount of response, you won't be flying blind. So it's nothing but good stuff with it. The harder part, actually, just from a voice of experience, is not installing it, but keeping it going down the road as you start getting more and more of this data. Where do you put it? How do you make sure your monitoring systems don't slow down and that type of thing?
That's right. Yes, how to avoid having being overwhelmed or too much of a good thing. Absolutely. I think, speaking of conferences, the one last article I threw in here was just a shout out to B-Sides SF, which, like many conferences over the last year, have gone virtual. But in this case, they went virtual and a little bit retro, just pulling together a couple of past presentations that all free streaming. And they had some interactive live chat over the weekend, too, as they were doing it, that you could also just go read with some of the presenters on Reddit. And I just wanted to highlight, one was, of course, Clint Gibler. We talked with him almost exactly a year ago about his presentation on security, how to 10x your security is what he labeled it. But it was a lot of these things about how should you approach a security program? And it touched on how many of your security engineers should become developers or doing development. How much, where do you have observability, as well as getting into some tactical areas like vulnerability management, such things like that. So if you want to go back and listen to episode 100, go check that out, or check this presentation out if you're not familiar with it. And just as another one, there was as a tie into our previous segment, our chat with Cynthia on privacy, there was another B-Sides presentation on anti-privacy, anti-patterns from Sarah Harvey. And I think that was just another one that can stand out as a good on theme for today's show.
Yeah, and another one, like I said, there was a bunch of good stuff going on over Portswigger on their security blog. There was an article I didn't put in, we didn't cover. I don't know if you saw this, Mike, around a new form of side channel on the ring bus between CPU cores. So that's interesting for folks to go browse. But then the last one on here you just made me think of, they've got a list of 2021 cybersecurity conferences. So we'll see how many of those happen in real life. But if you're looking for a list of things to attend or submit papers from, there's a good one over there.
That's awesome. So we've finally found homework for our listeners is to go check out that list of conferences and put them on your calendar to follow, or check out the CFPs. And if you've got some interesting ideas, go ahead and submit them. And also just let us know if you have some blogs or some other write-ups or tools that you're working on your own. We'd love to highlight them here. So with that, I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to thank John, of course, for joining and talking through the news and talking through all things fun and complex in data privacy. Thank you all again for joining us. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.